lot of people will have these blocks. They'll say, I don't believe in God or Jesus or Christianity.
So your video title asks, is religion just another myth, fairy tale, or legend, when you really mean Christianity? That's okay. We also focus on Christianity around here.
Because I think it was all made up.
Well, that depends on what you mean by made up. I think most Christians, including the early ones, were putting forth thoughts and ideas they genuinely believed in. An accumulation of well-meaning leaps and exaggerations is sufficient to explain Christianity as we have it today. If, when you say made up, you mean doesn't correspond to reality, then yeah, it's mostly made up. Welcome to Paulogia, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians. Today, we're looking at a short video from a channel called I Am Beggar. They describe themselves as stuff about God for those who believe, those who don't, and those who just aren't sure. Sounds like everyone. The creator wanted to marry his love of apologetics and animation, which I can totally get behind. So, you're attempting to explain a non-believer's take on Christianity.
It's a myth or a fairy tale or a legend.
I'm glad you're splitting up these categories, depending on how you define them.
They'll say that Jesus is just another mythical god pieced together from other mythical gods that already existed, such as Mithras, Horus, Dionysus, and others.
I see that you're conflating the concept of God and the concept of Jesus of the New Testament. It's the dying, rising miracle worker where some claim parallels, not the creator God like the one in the Old Testament. Those parallels would be creator gods from other cultures, like Marduk or Brahma or Atum.
Or that there's really no evidence in the first couple hundred years that proves he even existed.
No matter the topic, it's not helpful to boast that there's no evidence. For almost any theory on anything, you can find some evidence. There's some evidence that the earth is flat. There's some evidence that reptile people run the government. Someone can probably bring forth some evidence that the video you're watching now was created by a team of dolphins. This no evidence claim is generally inaccurate and always needlessly dismissive. Better to say that the evidence for a proposition is insufficient or unconvincing or overcome by evidence to the contrary. You don't have to conclude that there was a historical figure of Jesus to admit that there is some evidence that he did, however weak. Being overly hyperbolic is a barrier to being taken seriously.
Or that some guy named Jesus, not the Son of God, probably did exist, but everything else about him was made up and added on later.
Bing, bing, bing. That's the one. That's what I think, basically.
I'm not going to say a lot about these, but I will say this. For the first, this idea that Jesus was just an amalgamation of other ancient mythical gods.
One doesn't have to posit that Jesus was just an amalgamation of the other ancient mythological gods to notice and acknowledge that elements of the Jesus story are not wholly unique, and his stories arose in a time and context where such stories were commonplace and could easily have been direct or indirect influences. The original Star Wars isn't just an amalgamation of Buck Rogers, Flash Gordon, and Akira Kurosawa samurai films, but those were all direct or indirect influences. When Stan Lee was creating heroes like Spider-Man, Iron Man, and the X-Men, he wasn't directly copying from Superman and Batman, but he was working in a culture where stories of costume characters with extraordinary powers were circulating and popular. The overlap doesn't need to be one-to-one to recognize that the stories of Jesus contain tropes.
Who, according to this, had virgin births, were baptized, had 12 disciples, performed the same miracles, and were crucified, died, and resurrected as Savior of the world. Well, none of this is true.
Yeah, this phrasing is the most bombastic and hyperbolic, and requires creative interpretation and probably beyond how the text can charitably be stretched. And that's too bad, because by exaggerating how similar they are, it diminishes the impact of conversation about the actual similarities. Healing, raising the dead, providing miraculous wine, supernatural births, sacred meals, death and rebirth symbolism, just to name a few. Those were tropes, familiar story elements in the era of Jesus that undermine the notion that he was a particularly revolutionary or unexpected figure.
These claims can all be traced back to a couple guys in the 18 and 1900s who had no evidence.
Now Mr. Beggar is making the same mistake he chastised his opponents for, hand-waving away a hypothesis as having no evidence. Clearly there is some evidence. You may be unconvinced that the author of the Gospel of John specifically had Dionysus in mind when he wrote about Jesus turning water into wine, but you can't deny that stories of Dionysus supernaturally providing wine exist. It's some evidence.
Actually, all the evidence we do have shows these ancient mythical gods were really nothing like Jesus at all.
That depends entirely on your definition of nothing like Jesus at all. Some exaggerate the extent of the similarities, sure, but it's also all in the genre of gods interacting with men. So it's not entirely unalike. My assessment is somewhere in the middle, but I leave your determination as homework for the viewer.
Which is why every scholar, archaeologist, and Egyptologist dismissed these claims a long time ago. So we can throw this one out, and this is the one that's all over the internet.
If you want to posit Jesus as solely a literary composition, the burden of proof is pretty high, and academics tend to shy away from notions of absolute certainty. So this is true, but unsurprising. Such a claim is also unlikely to resonate with a devout believer, so it does little to encourage introspection or dialogue. Unfortunately, the more modest and defendable claim that Jesus is partially a literary composition, influenced by divine genre tropes of the day, is getting tossed out at the same time.
For the second, this idea that there's no evidence within the first few centuries that proves Jesus even existed, well, there's plenty of evidence.
I agree that Jesus probably existed, but plenty is a subjective judgment call. Just a statement that Mr. Beggar is convinced. Rather than labeling the positions, how about we just present the positions?
Just open a Bible, New Testament. Those are all first century accounts written by a bunch of very different guys who were all alive when Jesus was alive.
Scholars are not in total agreement that all 27 books of the New Testament were written in the first century, though I think it's plausible that they were. Alive when Jesus was alive doesn't mean much when the later authors would have been small children at best when Jesus was alive. The authors of Mark and Luke didn't meet Jesus, nor does Paul, associated with 13 of the books, ever claimed to have met Jesus before he died. Also, there is clear literary dependence in these books, so it's not really the kind of multiple attestation that one would be looking for or is currently being represented on screen.
There's also non-Christian evidence from Jewish and Roman historians, from those who are opposed to Jesus, and from those who didn't even like him. But those who hold this view argue that all the evidence was either forged, altered, or made up.
One of the more popular videos on my channel is this one, called Are There Authentic Secular Writings About Jesus? Some elements of these were definitely altered. That's not really in dispute. That said, I do think a few of these are reasonably solid, though not a slam dunk, when it comes to a historical figure. Not so much on these supernatural claims. I think proponents of Jesus mythicism would say that these references are being misinterpreted and/or are just telling us what Christians believe rather than what history tells us. But I will point you to another video on my channel, The Case for Jesus Mythicism, if you'd like to see a mythicist make their own best case.
There's really no evidence of Alexander the Great until 400 years after he died, but he existed, right?
There's no extant literary evidence for Alexander the Great until 400 years later, but there is a plethora of archaeological evidence, like coins, inscriptions, and artifacts honoring Alexander, dating all the way back to his lifetime. You're not comparing apples to apples here.
Even if you don't believe in Jesus Christ, Son of God, you can't just throw away all the evidence. That's too easy. Which is why today nearly all historians, whether Christians or not, accept that Jesus existed.
What does that have to do with being too easy? Are you saying historians act out of laziness?
Which brings us to the last one, that some radical preacher named Jesus probably did exist, but everything else about him was religious embellishment at best or completely and totally made up at worst.
There's also another category of sincerely mistaken. Christians may well have been passing along some believed details without exaggeration beyond their current understanding, but not actually rooted in fact.
Some say it was made up by his disciples, the Romans, by Constantine, by a bunch of rich white guys in Rome who wanted a lot of power, or just by sitting around the campfire telling stories over and over and over again.
It's likely that some of his disciples were involved. There seems to be some reasonable evidence that Peter and John met Paul at some point. but they needn't have made anything up in any kind of dishonest or malicious sense. They could just as easily have been sincerely mistaken about aspects of the story. Constantine came on the scene too late to have forged the core historical claims of Christianity, Jesus' death and resurrection. I do think his misguided efforts contributed to some of the later ancillary traditions still held today, but those are out of scope for this analysis. And yeah, the campfire telling stories over and over definitely happened. Most early Christians converted because of friends and neighbors, not because they encountered one of the original 12 disciples. And the first 40 years were without a written gospel, so word of mouth is how it spread. And during this time, a form of evangelical evolution must have taken place. If you tell the story once and your listener has objections, the next time you tell it, you incorporate your polemics against those objections. If that works, you repeat it again, and the adaptation now becomes part of all future tellings.
Well, the earliest evidence of Christianity that's pretty solid shows it was already fairly well established by around 64 AD.
I'm not sure what you mean by well established. Estimates of these numbers vary wildly, but are most realistically in the ballpark of tens of thousands of adherents. In terms of doctrine, there was still significant variations and debate over core orthodoxy still going on. That said, Peter and Paul died around that time, so their contributions were set. I'm not sure where you're going with this one.
And most of the New Testament is thought to have been written between the 50s and the 70s.
That's not true at all. Really, only the 7 undisputed letters of Paul are consistently dated before 70 AD. The Gospels and the other 16 books are most commonly dated after 70 AD, with only the most conservative evangelicals even making arguments for earlier. Again, since Mr. Beggar's point would work equally well by making the more modest claim of during the first century, he could have had the same evidence with less dispute or hyperbole.
So, we know it couldn't have been made up after this.
I bristle at the characterization of made up, but agree that some of the core Christian ideas existed well before Constantine in the 4th century.
And it's unlikely that his disciples made it up because, well, they all died very brutal, violent deaths for it.
Citation needed. Even accepting the most outlandish church tradition at face value, John and Judas weren't murdered. The most comprehensive study of this that I'm aware of, The Fate of the Apostles by Sean McDowell, concludes that of the original 12, only Peter and James, son of Zebedee, are strongly evidenced as being murdered. And Sean has recently downgraded his confidence in James. We're kind of down to just Peter in this murder claim. And if we're talking about one guy, it's pretty easy for one guy to be sincerely mistaken. Sincerely mistaken people will die just as readily as someone sincerely correct. In any case, this is just factually inaccurate, and Sean would tell you to stop saying this.
I think there's also been a hyper trust by many Christians who read martyrs and says, hey, they all died as martyrs, and they proclaim it. Well, I've made that claim in the past, so I repent on this show from making that before I did my research. That should be corrected as well.
So that leaves about 20 years of embellishing stories around the campfire to turn just some preacher named Jesus into the Son of God who healed thousands, fed thousands, changed the weather, rose the dead, walked on water, died and came back to life, and more or less changed the world as we know it until this very day.
Why 20 years? That's when Paul started writing, but Paul has almost no details at all about Jesus' life. There's really 40 years between Jesus' death and the writing of the first gospel, in which the stories could be embellished. And the non-canonical gospels show us that the stories of Jesus kept growing and growing, even after Mark was put to parchment.
Now, I can embellish with the best of them, but that would have to be the most mega mother of all embellishment in the history of the entire universe. Not to mention that all the people you're embellishing it for were alive when Jesus was alive.
We live in an era where each of us have history's greatest fact-checking machine in our pocket, and embellishments and false claims still circulate and are readily accepted during the lifetime of the people involved. It's probably happened to you that some false or exaggerated story was circulating about you, and you were actively trying to correct the record. And yet the story spread anyhow, despite your best efforts. The fictional George Washington cherry tree anecdote likely originated with his biographer and persists to this day. Napoleon Bonaparte was of average height, but tales of his minuscule stature and Napoleon complex spread and endured during his lifetime. Detractors of Russian mystic Grigory Rasputin made widely believed claims that he had occult-based superpowers to heal himself and others. John Henry, Johnny Appleseed, Paul Bunyan, all likely based on actual humble men. Cleopatra, Genghis Khan, Christopher Columbus, Wild Bill Hickok, Annie Oakley, P.T. Barnum, and on, all had widely accepted and rarely fact-checked near supernatural embellishments that took hold about them during their lifetimes. There probably were close associates and witnesses out there correcting the facts at every social gathering and every tavern they entered, but that's not going to stop the tide of a good story. This claim by Mr. Beggar is absurd. He must live in a very different fact-carrying society than I do to even say this with a straight face.
So you can't get away with too much without somebody saying, yeah, that didn't happen. I was there.
Okay, so the fireside storyteller talks about the time Jesus healed a man with leprosy. The listener can't pipe in and say, that didn't happen. I was there. Because this guy obviously wasn't with Jesus 24/7. The storyteller would rightfully say, no, it was another time. You weren't there. You can't disprove a murder charge bringing up a long list of people who insist that they've never seen the suspect murder anyone. That's not how any of this works. It's even sillier for the big claims, like virgin birth or resurrection. Those were private moments.
Myth and legend would have created a more predictable figure. And the experience of Jesus is so unusual that something much more substantial than the imagination is needed to explain it.
Predictable in what way? As we talked about up front, the claims about Jesus largely fall into the category of tropes at the time. Entirely predictable. Apocalyptic preachers were common at the time, with similar messages to Jesus's. The Dead Sea Scroll community's teacher of righteousness was a product of similar Old Testament interpretations. Tell me what exactly is unusual about Jesus, and by what measure can we judge which claims fall within the confines of expected mythology? This whole argument is an invitation to shallow thinking. What story is beyond human imagination?
But I'm sure you could argue any one of these points very well.
Why, thank you. I do my best.
And we could go back and forth and not really get anywhere except on each other's nerves. And we got to stop doing that. Seriously.
What do you mean not get anywhere? Wrestling with these questions and arguments are what made me eventually realize my faith in Jesus was unfounded. I get messages every day about the similar experiences of others. That's getting somewhere. And are you admitting that these points have no evangelical value? That people don't come to Christianity based on the preponderance of the evidence? I mean, I happen to agree with you, as do many apologists, that it's the Holy Spirit that saves, not the evidence. So I understand your appeal to stop thinking and examining.
Learn to circumnavigate or go around the person's intellect, the place of argument, and to speak directly to their conscience, to the place of the knowledge of right and wrong. That's what Jesus did.
But we're missing the point here. It really has nothing to do with any of this. So forget about all this.
So you do agree, arguments for Christianity are ineffective.
What it all boils down to is this. Is this man-made or is it from God?
You don't specify what you're referring to by this. So without clarification, I'll point out that there's a potential for category error and false dichotomy here. Something is man-made or God-made only if you can first establish that it was made. For example, I see no reason to conclude that matter and energy are made things. Even then, things can be made by entities other than man or God. What about beavers? What about demons or angels or Nephilim? What about other possible gods from other pantheons of gods? This is a poorly formed question.
Now my question is, Don't you think you'd be able to tell the difference?
This appeal to intuition is a bit of conflation, because when I start conjuring images of the Rocky Mountains, I obviously accept that humans didn't make them, but that doesn't leave God as my only alternative. Natural processes that we understand relatively well are responsible for the Rockies. That's not humans or God. If you want to argue that God created the natural processes, then we can have that discussion, but it's begging the question to insert God here for anything humans aren't directly responsible for. Beware this logically fallacious tactic.
I mean, wouldn't the gap between what is man-made and what is divine be huge and immense?
I would think so, which is why I find it so ridiculous that the arguments for the Bible being a book beyond a normal human book are so weak. If a divine being wrote a book, wouldn't the gap between it and the man-made ones be huge and immense rather than nuanced, subtle, arguable, and barely perceptible?
I mean, if I put something in front of you and said this was either man-made or from God, don't you think you'd be able to tell just by looking at it?
That's a car. Humans are capable of making cars. I've never been in a car factory, but I've seen a lot of video footage, as well as read books and documentaries on how the process works. Henry Ford's company produced documentaries about car manufacturing techniques. So yeah, while it's possible God made this car, it's reasonable for me to assume that a human made it, because I know that humans make cars. What's your point exactly?
Wouldn't that be all the proof you would need?
Are you talking about my own personal intuition upon first glance? No. Personal intuition isn't a reliable way to know something. That's the reason the scientific method had to be created in the first place. To have a more reliable way of determining things than our own limited snap judgment. And what would you do about competing intuitions? It's my intuition that the God concept is entirely superfluous and unnecessary to explain anything I've seen or experienced. Is that intuition all the proof I need?
I think you could tell. I think we all could tell because we all have that built-in meter inside us that detects on one side and truth on the other.
Are you kidding me? Are humans never wrong? Has no human ever been fooled or misled? My perceptions and best assessments turn out to be wrong all the time. This all-powerful God you're positing can be demonstrated only by the least reliable decision-making process that we know of.
And truth is what we're looking for here.
Is it? It sounds like you're looking for a good feeling. Maybe we don't agree on a definition of truth. I define truth as the extent to which a proposition conforms to reality, as adjudicated by predictive power. That takes my feelings and my intuitions out of the equation. A proposition conforms to reality, or it doesn't, no matter how I feel about it. If a proposition is true, there's almost always some measure of prediction of future data to go alongside it. If it's true that an object is red, we can predict the range of the wavelength of light reflected by the object. If no predictions can be made by a proposition, it is an unfalsifiable claim, and therefore not particularly useful.
So I challenge you, a friendly challenge in peace.
Okay.
Google the Sermon on the Mount. Sermon on the Mount. And actually read the thing. Don't worry, it'll only take you about 3 minutes.
I mean, as a teenager, I committed the Sermon on the Mount to memory. The whole book of Matthew, in fact. But sure, I can read it again.
A few minutes later.
And ask yourself.
Well, I'm not a fan of this question phrasing. Is he truth? Only propositions have truth value, not people. Is Paulogia truth? Is a nonsense question. So I'm going to be generous and rephrase, is the Sermon on the Mount true? I mean, we can start with the Beatitudes.
I think it was blessed are the cheesemakers. Well, obviously, it's not meant to be taken literally. It refers to any manufacturers of dairy products.
Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. That's obviously not universally true. Many have mourned and not been comforted in this life. Since I have no reason to think that humans have experiences beyond our one and only life, I'm not buying any counter that the comfort comes in the next life. And even so, most interpret the Bible to mean that only those who accept salvation from Jesus will have a positive afterlife experience. So many non-believers will mourn and not be comforted. So not true. We could do this verse by verse. Later on in the sermon, Jesus says, "But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. If this advice were literally true, why are Christian churches not filled with people with gouged out eyes? If it's only metaphorically true, what's the metaphor exactly? Still the same sermon. Do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. As a child of Western capitalism, this doesn't ring true to me. Why do Christians have locks on their doors? Take self-defense classes, own guns. Why has any Christian ever hired a defense lawyer? In what sense is this passage true? Most of this is advice. Advice is not a proposition. Advice can be evaluated only in the extent to which it helps accomplish a goal. What is the goal of the Sermon on the Mount so that I might evaluate it?
Nobody can tell you what is truth or not. You have to see it for yourself.
Do you mean the concept of truth? I can tell you what my concept of truth is, and you can tell me yours, and where there is overlap in our definitions, we can evaluate propositions based on the extent of that common understanding. Or do you mean that true propositions cannot be communicated? If I say George Washington was the first president of the United States of America, I have told you a true proposition, regardless of whether you've seen it yourself, or whether or not you even accept it as true. In any case, you've been told truth. Or do you mean that you cannot become convinced of truth without seeing it yourself? I'm convinced that we are made up of atoms, but I've never seen one. I'm convinced that India is a country, but I've never been there to see it. On the flip side, I've seen things that I don't believe. Optical illusions, mirages, hallucinations, mind tricks. And isn't that a theist's traditional knock against the non-believer? That they don't believe in a God because they haven't seen a God? And that is somehow short-sighted of them? The back half of this video has devolved into an unhelpful fortune cookie.
And if something sticks with you the rest of the day or the rest of the week, that's God.
If something sticks with you, that's God? Songs can stick with you. Are they God? When we do something embarrassing, that sticks with us. Is that God? We'll process problems for extended periods of time, sometimes eventually coming to the realization that we made a mistake, or that something was out of place, or that we've been duped or wronged. None of that is God, but it's something that sticks with us. And what about my lingering doubts about Christianity? I didn't give it up all at once. The doubts kept coming back and back. I started suffering cognitive dissonance. Those questions stuck with me. Was that God too?
Because God is truth. You can't make that up.
Despite the title affirming religion in general, Mr. Beggar pointed out a number of gods in history that he doesn't accept. And based on his catalog, I can see that he rejects plenty of non-Christian gods. In his view, someone made those up. So God can be made up. I hear Christians claim this all the time, but I think I've demonstrated here and in many other videos that Jesus is extremely inventable. For example, see my Too Good to Be False analysis of Tom Gilson's book of the same premise. Could some Christian please articulate this alleged gap between the most imposing thing that a human can invent and where Jesus is? Aside from becoming popular, a measure that also doesn't require the supernatural to explain, any objective observer will see that Jesus is entirely in line with well-established tropes in the God-man genre. It's too bad this historian from 1930 never got to see Star Wars. Choose God? Sorry, Mr. Beggar, but we don't actually have the capacity to choose what convinces us. To some extent, we can control how much of the evidence we'll listen to and to what extent we'll seriously consider it. But all the time and earnestness in the world doesn't allow us to simply choose to believe something we're not convinced of. Can you simply choose not God? No. You'd have to be convinced. And that's the end of that video, and also the end of our year. I'd like to take this chance to thank all of the amazing people who support the work of Paulogia through Patreon and YouTube memberships. If you find my work valuable and you're willing and able, please consider becoming a financial backer for as little as $1 a month. Christians love to give to their, so it means so much more when we countering Christianity help. Check the description for links, and thanks for watching. For more of this former Christian taking a look at the claims of Christians, tap on the thumbnail on screen now, and I'll see you over there. Until next time, later.